Hello, fellow human sexuality students. My name is April, and I did my project on arousal and non-concordance. So I first learned about this topic in this book written by Emily Nagoski. It's become pretty well known. It's called Come As You Are. Emily Nagoski is a sex educator, and she references research in her book to describe a lot of things about mostly female sexuality. So I just want to preface that most of the ideas that I am talking about in this presentation, I did get from Nagoski. I do reference my other research in this presentation, but most of the ideas that I talk about were inspired by her interpretations of the research that she's looked at. So let's open my presentation. So what is arousal non-concordance? Nagoski describes it as being about the relationship between the peripheral system, referring to the genitals, and the central system, referring to the brain. It's talking about the difference between expecting something sexual to happen and enjoying a sexual experience. So expecting has to do with having a physiological response, and enjoying has to do with a person's subjective arousal. So a lot of people actually have differences between their physiological response and their subjective arousal. So how is this possible? How can your physiological response differ from your subjective response? Well, it has to do with how we've learned what is sexually relevant. So our brain's reward center has learned to recognize things that are sexually relevant. And as we learn what's sexually relevant, we become classically conditioned to have an automatic physiological response. And then so the reward center is going to have to do with your physiological response. The dual control model and just context in general affects a subjective experience. So the dual control model is about sexual excitation and sexual inhibition and the different levels that each person has, and how those two interact together to create sexual desire and sexual arousal and subjective arousal. So context has a lot to do with excitation and inhibition, and context plays a large role in subjective arousal for everyone, but even more so, context is important for women. So in case you're still confused about what non-concordance is, I've included 2 examples. So Nagoski is a sex educator, and she has students come up to her at the end of class with questions. And in her book, she writes down a lot of questions and stories her students ask her about and tell her, and she changes the names and changes some things about the stories. But so these are anonymous stories. So this is an example of non-concordance with someone who wants to have sex, but they're not having a genital response. So this person says to Nagoski, to the teacher, they say, okay, so Henry and I were messing around, and I said, I'm ready, I want you. And he said, no, you're not wet, you're just humoring me. And I said, no, I'm totally ready. And he didn't believe me because I wasn't wet. So should I see a doctor? Is it hormonal? What's wrong? So this person thinks that there's something wrong with her because she's not having a genital response, but she believes that she is aroused. And here is another account of non-concordance with someone who is not enjoying a sexual experience. However, they're having a genital response. So this person says, I let him tie my wrists above my head while I was standing up. And he positioned me so I was straddling this bar that pressed against my vulva, you know, like a broomstick. And then he went away. He just left. It was totally boring. And when he came back, I was like, I'm not into this. He looked at the bar and he looked at me and he said, then why are you wet? And I was so confused because I definitely wasn't into it, but my body was definitely responding. So those are two examples of non-concordance. So this person felt not into this BDSM situation, but the body was responding. And this was very confusing for this person. And both of these two accounts are totally normal, and it doesn't mean that anything is wrong with you if you have non-concordance. It's very normal. So how do we know non-concordance is happening? How do we know that the genitals are having a response? Well, they've done studies. Chivers is someone who has done a lot of work in researching this. And in the Chivers study, they measure they looked at a bunch of studies that measured vaginometry, which is measuring the physiological response of a vagina, and philometry, which is measuring the genital response in men. So vaginometry, they use a photoplethysmograph, which is a probe that is like a tampon. It's inserted like a tampon. It's about the size of one, and it uses light to measure blood flow. And there's two things that this device can measure. Can measure the VBV and the VPA. And the VPA is the one that is most commonly used. And but the VBV is slow changes in blood pooling. VPA measures vasocongestion, so like the density of blood with each heartbeat. And to make the genital measurement, the genital response measurement more accurate, you can also use labial thermistor, which is a thermometer for the labia. There is, they also use the plethysmograph to measure male genital response. They measure various things like pupil dilation, heart rate, galvanic skin response, but the most specific measure, they say, of genital response is an erection. So they attach something that measures men's erections. And then, so how these studies go is they'll put subjects in a room and they'll show them sexually relevant videos, photographs, and while they have these instruments attached to people. And so they're measuring that while they're saying sexually relevant things, they also show them sexually unrelevant things. And then people record their arousal levels while they are being measured. So they record their own subjective arousal measure while their body is being recorded. And that is how we know about non-concordance, that they don't always match up. So both men and women experience non-concordance, and women experience more non-concordance than men. So men tend to be slightly more concordant, but it's still only 66% for men, but it's 26% for women. And something that Nagoski really makes a point to emphasize is that there's nothing wrong with concordance. Concordance doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you or that you have a sexual problem. Um, this is just how it is. And she says that the female experience, how women experience sexuality, isn't the like the bad way. Like there's a lot of assumptions that people make based on the statistic, assuming that there's something wrong with women because they don't experience concordance. But concordance isn't inherently evolutionarily disadvantageous or anything like that. In fact, it can be advantageous. So, however, what I found in my research is that everything that you can find about concordance is about women. So, this one study looks at stuff that we have studied in class, which is the dual control model. They look at sexual excitation and sexual inhibition. So the dual control model and how that influences concordance in women. So they want to know, why are women less concordant? What is this about? So they found in one of these studies that women who have less inhibitions, so women who are not very inhibited, tend to have higher rates of concordance. So their genital response matches their subjective response more frequently. And that people who are more women in the study who are more inhibited experience lower rates of concordance. So if you're more inhibited, your subjective experience and your physiological experience match up less. They found that setting influences concordance. So if they did like a questionnaire or something like that, asking women if they found, like, women who rated finding the idea of getting caught being sexually arousing, like or having sex in public places, women who said that to them was sexually arousing, those women who were in a laboratory tended to have it was concordant in the results. I've heard Nagoski references in her book that when women do the same tests, because there have been tests where women take the tests at home, that there's more concordance for every person. Women who are more inhibited, who are less inhibited, the concordance goes up. So context affects concordance, which makes a lot of sense. Something that was notable in this study was that it was that they found something that they weren't expecting to find. They found they looked at women who are worried about their sexual functioning, who tend to be worried that it takes them too long to have an orgasm, or worried that they're not getting turned on enough. So women who have anxiety about their sexual functioning actually have higher rates of concordance. And the people in the study speculated that maybe because they're worried about it, they pay more attention, so they have more mindfulness associated with they just, maybe not mindfulness isn't the right word, they have more awareness of how their genitals are responding. And this is a diagram. So you can see the blue is people who have high concerns about their sexual functioning. It's more correlated with the subjective sexual arousal and the genital sexual arousal, compared to women who are not that worried about it. They have lower concordance. Interesting. More research on women. They have done mindfulness research, which is they were studying, they were giving women mindfulness exercises to work on in between measurements, and they found something that I thought was kind of interesting. They found that when they came back, these women reported that they had, so yeah, that they I'm having trouble explaining how to word this. So after their mindfulness treatments, they found that a woman's subjective arousal was able to predict her genital arousal. However, they found that her genital arousal was still not able to predict her subjective arousal. So for me, I'm like, well, wouldn't that go hand in hand? I guess I haven't fully processed how that makes sense, but so your subjective arousal can predict your genital arousal, but it is also possible that that can be true and your genital arousal wouldn't predict your subjective arousal. So that was interesting to read about. You should all look at the study. It's in my references. Then I found this other article about this, because I'm just, it's interesting. People are really, really interested in why women are less concordant. So they've come up with this hypothesis called the preparation hypothesis. So what that is it's possible that women have developed a reflexive lubrication response to any sexual cue that could lead to penetration in order to prepare and hence protect the vagina from potential injury. So the person who wrote this article was really not into this hypothesis and argued that it is taking, assuming that like male experience is normal, and saying that it's a patriarchal perspective, and basically saying that it's just a not helpful perspective for women, and it's that she thinks that there's a lot of reasons why it isn't accurate. And what I thought was interesting was that Nagoski didn't talk about this whatsoever in her book. Instead, she explains genital response as an automatic reflex, classically conditioned in the reward center of the brain. She never said anything about protecting the vagina from injury, just that you have a genital response. So I thought that was interesting. What have I learned? A little bit of time. Okay, so what I learned is that genital response is classically conditioned in the reward center of the brain. It's not always sexual. So having a genital response is not always sexual. And I'll talk more about this in my and some slides that are coming up. But one reason that we know that it's not always related to something sexual is that men get erections in REM sleep, and it can happen when they're not dreaming about anything sexual. Genital response and subjective arousal are often are non-concordant. Both men and women experience non-concordance. I've also learned about that mindfulness thing that I told you about was interesting. That it can predict, the subjective arousal can predict genital response, not the other way around. I learned that most of the studies of non-concordance are on women, and they're trying to figure out what's wrong with women, or maybe not. Maybe it's not always what's wrong with women, but they want to know why. Nagoski drilled into me that non-concordance doesn't mean disordered. And what I learned that I think is really important, especially in the clinical part of this presentation, this is really important to carry on into that part of the presentation, is don't assume people experiencing non-concordance are lying to you. And we're gonna talk more about that because this is what I find most interesting. And this does get more triggering and upsetting. So just a warning. I'm going to start talking about sexual violence. So I find it both horrifying and humanizing that people can see and or experience acts of sexual violence and have a physical response and know that it doesn't have to match their subjective experience. So this happens. So clinical implications for working with clients. I think the most important thing about this topic when working with clients is to be really careful about these myths and assumptions that people put on physical responses, that people put on the body. People also put a lot of things that aren't actually true on the body. So I think as a clinician, you need to be aware of these myths so that you don't kind of give off this attitude to your client if they're experiencing non-concordance. So myth one, genital response equals turned on. And that's not true. And we know that it's not true. One of the reasons is because of what I talked about with men having erections during REM that are not related to when they're not dreaming about sex. Myth two, genital response equals enjoying. And where this is really, really dangerous is when we talk about sexual assault victims, because a lot of sexual assault victims have genital responses. Sexual assault victims can have orgasms while they're being assaulted, and it doesn't mean that they enjoyed it. And this can turn into victim blaming and can create problems in courts, and ultimately it can create problems in laws too. Like they talk about how women can, facilitate an abortion for themselves if they're raped, if they were actually raped, that they wouldn't so conceive a child. And people can witness sexual violence and have erections. And Nagoski talks about this like horrific account of someone told her that they saw rape and they didn't do anything because they were so embarrassed because they had an erection, and they thought that it meant that they were a terrible person or that they were like a rapist. So they just left and they didn't do anything because they were so confused. So if that person had known about non-concordance, maybe they would have intervened. And myth three, that non-concordance is a problem. So non-concordance is not a problem. It can be evolutionarily beneficial to have a genital response, see something sexually relevant and not engage with it, because maybe it would be dangerous for you to be pregnant. Maybe there's a famine. Maybe you're about to get eaten by a lion and it's not a good time to have sex. There's a lot of situations where it would be disadvantageous to have sex and conceive. So context is a big deal. And the other problem with this myth of assuming that it's a problem is that there's potential for sexism, and assuming that because men are concordant, that that's the normal thing and that women need to be more like men. So as a clinician, I think it's important to be aware of these things because you can have clients who come in with these assumptions and you can work with them and educate them and reassure them if they had a very confusing experience that made them think they were a bad person or had something confusing happen in a sexual assault. So why is this important? I hope you're getting an idea why non-concordance can be really important to know about. I think it's really important because of consent, because of non-concordance can be used in coercion and in sexual violence. So myths can cause victim blaming. They can make people confused about what they enjoy if they're having a genital response, but they don't like it. They might think, well, maybe I do enjoy this thing, and it might confuse them about what is actually true for them. And it can confuse people about what they want to consent to. So, yeah, just to make clear, people can witness and or experience things such as brutal sexual violence and have physiological sexual responses. This happens because the person recognizes something that is sexually relevant, not because they're aroused. Sometimes the inhibitors from the dual control method don't engage to prevent the body from responding to sexually relevant stimulation. This can happen for a number of reasons, possibly substance use or being, snuck a drug, or simply just not having an inhibited sexual psychology. So you could have low sexual inhibition in your dual control psychology. And I included this passage because I think Nagoski just really hits these points that I want to make very well in this passage. She's talking about this book written by Elaine de Botton called How to Think About Sex. Elaine de Botton goes so far as to describe lubricating vaginas and tumescent penises as, quote, unambiguous agents of sincerity, end quote, because they're automatic rather than intentional, which means that they can't be faked. So I think it's really important to say this because I think a lot of people think that. And Nagoski replies, if that's true, then when your doctor taps your knee's patellar tendon and your leg kicks out, that must mean you actually want to kick your doctor. Or when you have an allergic reaction to pollen, you must hate flowers. Or when your mouth waters around a mouthful of moldy bruised peach, you must find it delicious. Don't get me wrong, you might want to kick your doctor and you might hate flowers and you might enjoy moldy bruised peaches, but your automatic physiological processes are automatic, not sincere. Your automatic physiological processes are automatic. If we persist in the false belief that women's genital response reflects what they really want or like, then we have to conclude that their genitals respond, that if their genitals respond during sexual assault, it means they really wanted or liked the assault. So I hope that it's really obvious by now that we need to believe people's words and not their bodies. That's something that really struck me throughout reading this book and throughout reading this material. And it's not something that, I'm an athlete. I'm basically like work as a professional athlete. I use my body to make money. I have been a raft guide for 10 years. I work in ski patrol. I've taught yoga. I've taught bar. I think that there's a lot to learn from the body. However, when we're talking about sex, when we're talking about consent, you need to believe, and when we're talking about subjective arousal, so much of it is subjective, and it's just so important to believe people's words and not their bodies. So I will leave you with that. These are my references. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope you understand arousal non-concordance and that you will teach it to all of your friends.